Welcome to Ambitious Science Teaching, Chapter 9, starring Madison Redding and Taylor Richardson.
What I took from this section, one of the first things that I liked, it said to base your directions and how kids are going to do things, like adjust the intellectual demand for things. So like you can do simple things and you could do hard things. Like for example, you can have them collect data or you can have them analyze data, which is kind of just a step above. And I think that's good in directions just on a day-to-day basis to keep things like meaningful.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, Taylor. I think that when we're trying to decide what activity to do, I think we definitely really need to know our class. I know in the book, Taking a Direct Quote, teachers need to mix and match these experiences depending on their own backgrounds or curriculum that they're using. So kind of knowing our class and knowing what works for them, what they're interested in, and what their favorite hands-on activity is kind of helps us kind of guide what activity that we want to do and what would be most efficient and provide the most well learning experience for our kids in class.
Yep, I agree. And one thing I think too is important to highlight that I liked at least is when you're talking out like directions or activities or whatever it may be, it said to model your thinking out loud for students and engage them in like sense making talk. So you can kind of walk them through like your thought process and then allow them to like explore and understand an idea and be able to apply that to real world events. And I think that's kind of the key for like meaningful activities because like you can have them do stuff, but at the end of the day, if that's not related to something that they experience in their day-to-day life, I just don't think it sticks as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like you said, talk kind of working through something out loud is better than working through it in your head. And you, I feel like you learn more and know more when you do that as well.
Yeah. And then just touching base on framing, I thought this was cool too. The book described framing. The way that you frame is like the expectations that you have for your students for them to approach those activities. And again, kind of going off that sense making talk and like knowing your class, like you were saying, Madison, you describe how the activity can advance their thinking and then include like how they will use that in their day to day and just give them verbal guidance and make sure that you're kind of walking around the room and checking on them and asking follow-up questions.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you keep going.
I kind of just to play off that framing a little bit, and I think framing kind of opens their mind up a little more before you even start that conversation because you kind of tell them the expectations, kind of give them a little bit of an inside peek, so then they're already thinking, they already have their brain going, their brain is warmed up, and they're ready to kind of dive in more, and it kind of preps them for the activity itself or the lesson or the phenomenon itself and getting them excited to participate, as well as, sometimes they come into class not awake or not, not completely there. But once you kind of preface what's going to happen, they kind of start thinking and gets their brains a little bit warmed up I think is kind of one of the big keys that I've taken away as well throughout this whole book, not just this chapter.
Yeah, I agree 100% too. I think the best way, honestly, to describe framing is like giving them the most explicit directions as possible while also being vague enough that they will be willing to like further explore it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah. But okay, let's move on to back pocket questions and what a meaningful activity would look like. So basically what I took as back pocket questions are like when you are moving around the room and interacting with students while they're working in groups. You have a couple questions ready to go for different scenarios that aren't just like the how are we doing? Do we need help with anything? So they either can stimulate discussion for kids that like maybe don't fully understand or aren't really communicating. But I think like the key point in those is just making sure that you are like stimulating that discussion.
And like, sometimes when, you get asked, hey, how are you doing? You kind of panic a little and you're like, I'm fine. Or, you never really know what to say. And I think when you ask them more specific questions, like, hey, can you say more about the topic? Or, let's start thinking about what we think may be happening inside the soda can. When we looked at that demonstration, it kind of gives them more like more of a specific question, so they have more of a specific answer. They can't just be like, yeah, I'm good. And then as a teacher, we can also gauge where they are better by asking those specific questions, just to see kind of exactly where they are.
Yeah, no, 100%.
I think another really good one is like, do you guys all agree? So if they're all in group work, like they could all have the same idea or the same reasoning, or one person has a completely different idea, and it's just interesting to see how different the kids think and all that good stuff, their rationale.
Yeah, and I mean, in all reality, you can even use those as like little mini assessments to see like if you did a good enough job. Because like when people are like, how are you doing? I'm not going to say that I'm doing bad. I'm going to say I'm fine, and then ask someone else for help because I'm too embarrassed to say so in front of my friends. So yeah, I 100% agree. Cool. So I think really the only thing that we have left to do is to give a brief set of directions.
I think you're right. Would you kind of like to take that away, Taylor?
Yeah, totally.
I know you had a great example earlier about the worksheet.
Yeah, so what I took from it in the book, basically, you want to make that activity as meaningful as possible, obviously. One thing that I liked that the book pointed out was you can supply them a worksheet that allows them to actually engage in the content versus them just focusing on filling stuff out. And kind of same with that, the moving around of the classroom, just making sure that during those visits, you try to have all of your kids contribute and not to press them with questions if you aren't going to follow up with questions later on. I feel like a lot of time teachers can kind of like bombard almost when you're not asking those questions, like, how are you doing? Or when you start discussing the content and you start asking those questions that make them have like higher order thinking, I think as educators, we need to really be careful about like how much we push, because if you ask too many of those, they're just going to get completely overwhelmed.
I totally agree. And kind of talking about maybe how like a direction set could look like if we had kids in a group setting or a group thing. We could walk as teachers. We could walk up to them and be like, "Hey, what are we thinking about? What's our concepts, our ideas that we're working through here?" And kind of allow the students to kind of talk about it, what they're thinking, and then maybe if we think something's a little confusing or want them to elaborate more, be like, "Hey, what do you mean by that? Like, you said this, this, and this, but how did you come to that conclusion," kind of thing. And then maybe prep them for preparing to share. If you think that, if you have a student that never shares in class, but they're kind of really excited about the topic, or, you just kind of see them sparkle a little bit, maybe be like, "Hey, that was really good what you just told me. Maybe we can say it to the class. Or maybe would you feel comfortable talking to the class about what you just said or something?" And kind of that also helps you kind of get those kids more comfortable with speaking out loud and being out there and participating in class discussion.
Yep, I agree 100%. I think that ties back to, I believe it was chapter 7 too, that talked about having either those individual students or those small groups go up and allow them to like compare phenomenons and kind of get them really engaged in that meaningful conversation. And I think honestly that the meaningful conversation is probably one of the most, or at least one of the concepts in the book that is like repeated a lot. So I think if you follow all these steps, you should be able to really get the students involved, engaged, and supporting them and, having like an ever-changing opinion and really get them thinking.
Yeah, I think I think we summed up chapter 9 really well, Taylor. And dived in and kind of analyzed it a little more than what the words are on paper. And I think that it really is beneficial to read this book and look over the different tips and tricks. And as like an emerging teacher, it's nice to know that times are changing within the classroom, because when you and I went to school, it was all book work, or it was all this, that, and it was just not engaging. Where we're kind of starting a new framework and we're getting students engaged, and which is really awesome.
Yep. And I think one advantage that we do have is maybe our senior year was taken away by COVID, but at the same time, once we start student teaching and even actually teaching, I think we're going to be met with a lot of students who are really eager to get back in the classroom and get that hands-on experience. So I think if we take the information from chapter 9, or really the information from the entire book, and apply even just a little bit of that to our future classrooms, we should have pretty good success.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I appreciate y'all, Dr. D, you listening to our podcast.
Yeah. Well, all right. Peace out, Girl Scouts.
Peace out.